Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Tortoise. Welcome to our newsroom. Welcome to our special Monday night thinking with Philippe Sands. Thank you for braving economic viral Armageddon to join us this evening. I can see some familiar faces here. Who's been to a ThinkIn before? So quite a lot of people, but you still have to hear my spiel about what a ThinkIn is. I'm sorry. So it's not a Q&A. It's not a one-to-one with me and Philippe. It's a system of organised listening where we get to talk about interesting ideas of the moment. And it works best when we hear from as many people in the room as possible. So that includes you. We do usually have a rule, which is no questions. We'd like to uphold that as best we can, but we do also soften it for our Monday night guests. But if you do have something to say, don't hide behind a question. Just say it. We'd love to hear it. Couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We love you talking about us on social media. Please do that, but do turn off your phones or the volume of your phones while this is going on if you can. I must introduce Agatha, our tortoise timer, who makes her way across the screen for an hour. Keep your eye on Agatha. Stick your hand in the air and say your name if you have something to say. Don't leave it to the last 5 minutes like too many people do. And just to say, you're being filmed for the members who can't join us tonight or are too scared. That's what this little moving robot is. So I have to tell you, you're being filmed. So it's my pleasure to introduce Philippe Sands, barrister, founder of Matrix Chambers, specialist in international law, president of English Pen, author of 16 books, including the Bailey Gifford winner, is it 17 now, East-West Street, and with this one, with the Ratline, not out yet, but out next month, plug, the Ratline, the story of Otto von Wachter, who was also the subject of the podcast of the same name. And I'm also obliged to say he is also fun. He complained that we sent a tweet out that made him not fun. So
you made me negative. You made me seem dark.
Okay.
Negative and sort of miserable.
Okay. So I'm going to try not to make you seem dark and miserable, but at the same time, may I start by asking you to talk about the idea of what we take for granted? Because I was particularly struck going back to your Bailey Gifford acceptance speech, where you compared Lviv, where the city where your grandfather's family was murdered, along with thousands of other Jews and Poles, to London, the multicultural, vibrant, happy city that you live in now and that we're having this thinking in. And do you still make that comparison in your mind, and why?
Absolutely, I make that comparison. And in fact, the publication of East-West Street in the spring of 2016, I think coincided absolutely with a moment where in this country xenophobia, nationalism, populism, which was already incipient, had begun to really take root. And we saw an absolute expression of that a month after the book came out. I don't argue for cause and effect, but...
You did it!
And we see it now. I see it with my students, some of whom, a group of Asian students, a group of Japanese students who said to me they will not set foot outside London anymore because they're too frightened. And you will ask for what exactly is your fear motivated on? And it's based on a perception that the other, the foreigner, is no longer welcome in this country. And that has been the position of this government. And it has not been denied, and it is the starting point for what came in the 1920s and the 1930s. I want to be absolutely clear. I'm not saying we are going down that route again in this country or anywhere else. What I'm saying is that at moments of difficulty and crisis, the simple option has always been to focus on the other and blame the other, and that's how it begins. And the point that you're making, Maropi, is that I often imagine how it would have been in the 20s and 30s if anyone... Who here has been to Lviv, out of interest? So it's very few people. It's an extraordinary place. It was a bit like London. It was a sort of bustling metropolis, huge on mathematics, economics, philosophy,
amazing
linguistics, literature, amazing universities, amazing food, a hub of multicultural activity just swept away completely in the space of 25 years. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, could it happen here? And the answer is, of course it could happen here. We cannot take anything for granted.
Okay, so with that in mind, may I ask you a very sort of live topic, which is, what do you make of the current government's threats to withdraw from the European Court of Human Rights? And please correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I read, fun fact, that if the UK government abandoned the ECHR, it would join just Belarus, an authoritarian dictatorship, as the only European country not party to it. Is that right?
It is absolutely right, and I think that that is what they are committed to doing. And their view is to basically shred the world they created in 1945. United Kingdom and the United States led the world in creating a rules-based system based on the idea of multilateral arrangements. It begins at a particular moment in time, in August 1941, off the coast of Newfoundland, and you can trace it to a single piece of paper. I opened an early book that I'd written, Lawless World, with it, the Atlantic Charter, and there you see the model for what was created between 1945 and 1949, a world based on rules, on multilateralism, on a prohibition on the use of force, on self-determination and the rights for individuals, and global free trade based on multilateral rules. And the two countries, the combo of Make America Great Again and Brexit, is to shred that. Anyone who thinks Trump is bonkers is wrong. There is absolute reason behind what he is doing. I can illustrate it very easily. The effort to replace the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, with two bilateral treaties, premised on the replacement of a trilateral arrangement with two bilateral arrangements, which gives the United States much greater leverage. The United States has stopped the WTO dispute settlement body system from functioning by not appointing the judge to which it is entitled, the member of the appellate body. And that has brought the appellate body system to a grinding halt. And the greatest supporter of the United States is the United Kingdom in supporting this new world order. And I think absolutely they are committed to withdrawing the United Kingdom from the European Convention on Human Rights. That is not what they will say. It will be by stealth, bit by bit, and you can begin to look out for it in who they appoint on their so-called Commission on Constitutional Change and so on and so forth. Watch out for two names, Martin Howe QC and Professor John Finnis. And if those two names are associated in any way with it, you will know exactly what the real agenda is. That's the positive side, isn't it?
Did we say fun?
That's not to say they will succeed in the effort. That's a very different thing.
Okay. So actually, I was talking to a colleague about East-West Street, and he said, you know, the realisation of reading that book to him was really how recent and how very fragile our human rights laws seem. Do they seem fragile to you as someone who works?
They are fragile, but I also think they're well established. So I teach at UCL, and I think one of the things that a teacher at a university has to do is make sure that you leave those you are in the classroom with a feeling that their generation actually has a really important role to play. And they do, because the seed that was sown in 1945 was a revolutionary seed. I mean, people, again, take for granted what we have now. What we have now is the idea that each of us, as individual human beings, have minimum rights under international law. And they assume, most people, that that has existed since time immemorial. It has not. It was invented at a single moment in time in the summer of 1945 in the United Nations Charter, the first reference to fundamental freedoms and human rights. There was no reference to it before June 1945, and the entire edifice has been constructed off the base of that instrument with a whole raft of treaties. And the revolution was to say for the first time that the rights of the sovereign are no longer absolute in relation to the citizenry. In other words, it's not just domestic law which constrains the sovereign, it's something called international law. It happens in relation to individuals, and it happens in relation to groups. And the groups thing is expressed in the first ever multilateral treaty on human rights, and that is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, which of course was invoked by the Gambia, for whom I act against Myanmar, and which caused, remarkably, Aung San Suu Kyi to turn up at the International Court of Justice in The Hague in December and argue against the claim that her country was involved in a genocide against the Rohingya community. Now, the thing about it is it's recent and it's fragile, but it has supporters in a range of different and interesting places. And I think that if you look across the history of international law over 300 or 400 years, you'll see that it's a story of a couple of steps forward, one step sideways, one step back, another step forward. Construction, destruction, reconstruction, destruction again, reconstruction, and every time it's reconstructed, if you go back to the 17th century, it's always reconstructed on the basis of what came before. So I think if you look over the long term, the basis for a sort of human rights model is strong, but I think we're in for a very rocky road in the next 10 to 20 years.
Okay. I know I'd love to see hands. I just would like to ask you something about the Ratline, which has been sort of playing on my mind since listening to the podcast and reading the book. I mean, how many people are familiar with the Ratline here? So a lot of people, and obviously, you know, this is the story of Otto von Wachter, who was the governor of Galicia, as I said, the place where your grandfather's family perished. But you have created this incredible relationship with his son Horst, and that's what made the podcast and indeed the book possible, because he opened up his files to you. Are you still close? Are you still talking? Because it's such an interesting tension that you have together, which is you trying to persuade him of what his father really did, and his denial, and trying to persuade you that his father was a respectable man just acting under pressure.
Yeah, it's sort of like an exercise in double advocacy. I tried to persuade him that his dad was a criminal. He tried to persuade me that his dad's basically a great bloke. And we've both failed totally after 10 years. And
is it 10 years you've been talking now?
10 years. I met him in 2011 when the son of Hans Frank, who was Hitler's personal lawyer, introduced me to him. And I think Horst sort of regrets it, and I know that his brothers and sisters and nephews and nieces deeply regret it. But a number of people ask, why did you do the podcast before you did the book? And there was actually a strategic reason for that, is that as with the film My Nazi Legacy, which was a BBC Storyville film that came out a year before East-West Street came out, I had a hunch, and even more actually with radio. I'm a completely passionate lover of radio and podcasts. It reaches audiences just in ways that you cannot imagine. I had a sense that someone somewhere would listen and something would happen. And that was exactly what happened. Within an hour, I'm not going to give it away, spoiler alert, within an hour of the episode 10 being broadcast, I received an email that was totally unexpected. And that has had a dramatic consequence of my relationship with Horst. Another family...
Cliffhanger! Exclusive cliffhanger!
Another family member who got in touch unexpectedly, and that has had consequences. But as with East-West Street, one of the real joys of writing a book, as many people who've written the book will know, is there's a lot of really smart, intelligent people out there who read and see points of detail and get in touch and share it with you and show you where you've got something wrong, or whether you've got something right but you could have made it even righter, or whatever. And you get an amazing sort of feast of materials, and in that material are nuggets of absolutely extraordinary stuff. And so just today I get an email from the daughter of the woman whose villa in Vienna was appropriated by the Wachters. Having heard the podcast, she lives in Australia, in Brisbane, and ascertained that the fine china tea set, which was still in the Villa Mendel in 1938 in the spring, continues to be in the possession of the Wachter family, and she wants it back. And it's
Are you going to be the broker for that?
well, I mean, this is already on the podcast. Horst already said on the podcast, if they ever got in touch, of course, he would want to give it back. But now he's taking refuge in the fact that it's huge and it's going to cost thousands of euros or dollars. And he's completely impecunious. He lives in this fantastic ancient schloss, but he's completely broke. He basically lives in one room with no heating. And he doesn't have any money, and he can't afford to send it back. The folks in Australia can't afford to get it transported back. I'm thinking, should I do that? So then I had a bright idea. Actually, I had a bright idea with the lady in Australia. I said, what about an Australian newspaper reuniting you with your tea set?
That's good.
And
Strong.
because it turns out that shipping things by sea doesn't happen anymore. You've got to send it all airmail, and sending a 400-piece China tea service. I mean, it costs thousands of euros to do it if you've got to insure it and everything. So there's practical issues. But coming to your question, the relationship with Horst remains very much alive and very much complex. I will see him. The book is being launched in Vienna on the 21st of April, coronavirus permitting. And he keeps on asking me for PDFs of the book.
So he hasn't read the book?
No, I'm not going to let him have the book until I see it at 4 o'clock that afternoon and give it to him.
Do you ever think that sort of his denial is really, Niklas Frank's coping mechanism is to say, as you've said, every opportunity, my father was a monster. And his coping mechanism is to, there's a scene in the My Nazi Legacy where you are really taking him to task for his denial in the Galicia sort of, government hall. And I have to say, I found it really difficult to watch because I ended up feeling a bit sorry for him.
I know.
Because I just thought he just doesn't want to compute it. It's his coping mechanism.
I mean, my mother-in-law hates that scene, and she calls it the elder abuse scene.
A little bit.
It's the only time in 10 years of knowing Horst that I lost my rag. I'm a barrister, and there may be. Are there any other barristers here? There's one. You sort of know that the one thing you do is you just stay. You don't reveal what your own feelings are, whether you're doing well, whether you're doing badly. It's just an even keel. But finding myself in that room with material that was absolutely dispositive, in my view, of what his dad had done, and he just absolutely, I just was enraged and showed my anger momentarily. And unfortunately, my dear friend David Evans, the film director, was there with a camera rolling
in your face.
and caught it. And the relationship with David is a very close friend, but it's his film, it's not my film. And the deal was, ultimately he decides what's in it. It's not my call.
Well, it's great TV. It's just quite uncomfortable.
It's uncomfortable, but it does what it was intended to do, which is as David says, he could have made an easy film, which is to show there is a good one that everyone loves because he hates his dad, and there's the horrible one who everyone hates because he loves his dad, and he turns it around. And you feel, some people, not everyone, an empathy, but at the end of the day, I feel an empathy for Horst because going through the making of that, David and I, acutely conscious of the dangers of where this was going, and so we got help from psychoanalysts and psychiatrists, actually, informing us and advising us, including giving advice to take very great care about where this could lead to. And at one point, one of the psychoanalysts said, he's like his Schloss. The walls are thick on the outside and it looks like it's impenetrable and it's completely solid, but actually the moment you go inside you see the whole thing's on the verge of collapse. And we would say, well, by collapse, what do you mean? And anything, and the psychoanalyst who was a friend said, absolutely anything, take care. And so the crucial scene in the film takes place at a moment he's describing in 1945, April 45, the war is coming to an end, he knows that his world is about to collapse, it's his 6th birthday party, and it's one of the only 2 moments in the 10 years that I've known him that he wept in my presence. And it was describing that moment that he knew his world was coming to an end, and it was a moment of intense trauma, and I think the psychiatrists, the psychologists and psychoanalysts will say, as they do say, that is a moment he has relived for the entirety of his life. Just as for Nicholas Frank, the moment that he has relived for the entirety of his life is the moment that he saw his father for the last time in the prison cells at Nuremberg, and his father said to him, I will be home for Christmas, and the 7-year-old boy knew that was a lie and was incandescent with fury with his father for lying to him on the last occasion they ever saw each other. And we were children, we have children, we know that these relationships are incredibly complex, and having lived through that with Horst, he's not always my cup of tea, but I feel strangely protective towards him. And one of the things I've done in the book, which some people will not like, is make absolutely sure that his account is fully told. And I don't comment on his account, I give an alternative set of facts, but I allow him the space so that, he can say, as he did on the podcast, all the interpretations he has, and he can't complain and say we cut him off or we edited him or we censored him. Everything he says is available.
I'm looking for a show of hands. If I don't see one, because there's a danger I'm going to yabber on otherwise. Hello, James.
I'm a colleague from the Therapies here and an editor here. My name's James Harding. But the thing that Philippe, I wanted to talk a bit about. So there's a moment in the Ratline on the podcast that actually I found very confusing. So to a certain extent, it sort of gives the game away right at the beginning when you find out that Otto von Wachter actually became a member of the Nazi Party, I think, in 1923, right? So you've got a pretty good inclination of the fact that he wasn't, frog marched into this. But there's a moment when I think Himmler comes to Lemberg and then says, look, do you want a job in Vienna? And he says, no, I'll keep doing what I'm doing. And it was only one moment in the whole thing where I thought, I wonder whether there is a more generous interpretation here, which is that, look, if you work within that system, everyone knows what everyone's job really is. And if you say, actually, I'm going to leave Lemberg and I'm going to take up a job in Vienna, Himmler knows that you're not made of steely stuff. You've actually ducked the difficult work. And everyone knows within those systems that you're sort of being tested. And I wondered whether or not that there are these subtle clues that you can never pick up in the history, you can never actually pick up in the text, if you like, in anything that's left, because there are things that are unspoken in the way in which systems like that work.
I think there's a broader resonance. Again, I want to be very careful to say I'm not comparing then with now, but there is the crucial question of what our friends who work as civil servants in the US and the UK should be doing. At what point is a line crossed where you say, that's it, I can't have truck with this anymore? I hadn't had it until now, until this government, because the majority had been, there was no majority, and so the government really was hamstrung in what it could do. But now that it's got a big majority, basically we're seeing what's happening. And civil servants are being asked to do things, and I know from my friends in the Foreign Office and in the Home Office and other places, to do things that are really causing them to ask themselves serious questions. And I know it also from my friends in the US. So what I was interested in telling that story was sort of asking myself the question, what would I do? Actually, what would I do? At what point is a line crossed? And I think I have to put my hand on my heart and say, I don't know. Yeah. I don't know at what point I would do that. But the timing of the Wachter moment was crucial. It was August 42. Frank has just arrived in Lemberg. He has just announced and ordered the murder of 500,000 people. And he wants to be sure that the governor who is in place is going to deliver on that. The killings have not begun on the ground at that point. Himmler arrives and basically they want to check out that he's ready to deliver. And in the book there's a lot more surrounding that and the relationship with Himmler than we could get into the podcast. But there are a number of points to be made in relation to that. What Horst says is, yes, he knew what was coming. Yes, he knew what he was being asked to do. But at the same time, there were millions of others, Ukrainians, that he was protecting. And that he took steps in that position to create a protective embrace for another community. So Horst does not deny that 500,000 Jews and Poles were killed in that area over those months in that period. But he says, but on the other hand, look at the positive things my father did when Hitler and Himmler wanted to do these other things to the Ukrainians. And that's the argument that he makes. And I don't buy that argument, but if you go to Ukraine, you will find there are a lot of people who celebrate Otto Wachter as a German who stood up for the Ukrainian community at a time when the Jewish community and the Polish community was getting a lot of a better deal than the Ukrainians. And he is recognized by that community as someone who created a sense of Ukrainian identity, of Ukrainian national spirit, and that is a positive thing. So that's the counter argument. The other point that's for me the beating heart of the Ratline, and you get it much less in the podcast, is the relationship with Charlotte, the wife. Because all of us know from our own situations that the role of our partner in our lives is absolutely crucial. What we say, what we don't say, what we share, what advice we take. This happens to me. I mean, there's at least one member of the bar, so I'm going to be very careful what I say, but the cases you take, the cases you don't take, the cab rank principle doesn't apply in the international domain, but generally I'll act for anyone who comes. There are a couple of instances where I have declined to act, and that has in both cases followed advice given to me by Natalia, my wife, who has a different approach to things. She's American, she's a different kind of lawyer, and you need those people you bounce ideas off. And so what I was fascinated about was what were Charlotte and Otto talking about. And Horst, bless him, gave me the entire diaries of his mother. 20 years of diaries. From 1929 to the moment he dies in 1949, she records a lot. Not everything, but with 3 fantastic PhD and graduate students, and inspired by Lisa Jardine, to whom the book is dedicated, we decoded the diaries, and you have the role of the partner. And that's one of the reasons why in a lot of the interviews that I'm doing in the book, once it comes out, I've wanted to do them with women rather than men. With Ali Smith at Dawn's, with Elif Shafiq at the London Library, because I think the female perspective on the story will be different in very general terms from the male perspective. And I want to get a sense from those two and from others of their take on what's going on between the lines of the letters and the diaries.
The other barrister in the room.
The other barrister in the room.
So since James asked a question, and contrary to all rules of Tortoise,
I'm a bit more relaxed on Monday.
so one of the things in the Ratline is how the Americans and the British used German Nazis after the war as sort of agents against communism. And I didn't know that really until I listened to the podcast. And so how far up did that go in the administrations of both those countries? And it sort of follows on from your point about sort of where do civil servants draw a line?
I didn't have that either. I mean, it was just, Otto Wachter disappears off the face of the earth on the 9th of May 1945. He reappears 4.5 years later, dead, in a Vatican hospital. And the timing for that is wonderful, with Pius XII's secret archive now being opened, and wonderful writers like David Kurtzer, who is the one person you really should have here, because he is the great historian of Pius XII and Pius XI and the secret archives, and they've let him into the archives. It'll take years for the stuff, it'll take absolute years for the stuff to emerge and to come out. I didn't know about that. I was so stunned about it as we began to uncover, because what we've got is 4 years of coded letters and diaries in German, which a group of us, really this is why it's dedicated to Lisa, she said there'll be material in the letters that will be unexpected. And I owe her, she's no longer with us. Listen to her Desert Island discs, done as she, an incredible human being, an absolutely incredible human being. She said there'll be stuff in there, and she was right. And we found the stuff, and we completely uncovered a story which pointed to the fact, without wanting to give too much away, those of you who listen to Ratline will know that, and more has come out since the podcast was made, because spooks write to you and send you more stuff, that the Americans and the Brits knew where he was, and were keeping tabs on him. And I was so stunned. One of my favourite episodes is episode 6, where I go and I have many wonderful advantages in life, but one is that I happen to have a neighbour who writes books about espionage, whose name is John Le Carre. And I said, this is really confusing me that this is going on, and I need to get a handle on this, whether I've got this right, have I misunderstood? He said, send me a few documents, come with some cakes, and we were talking about it. And we sat drinking tea and eating cakes, and he'd done preparation. It's really astonishing. And the first thing he said, and you get it, it's recorded as it happened in the podcast episode, he says to me, I was there in 1949. I said, what? He said, yeah, I was an 18-year-old soldier, and my job was to interrogate Nazis and to choose the ones we could recruit in the struggle against the Soviets. And he said it was really confusing, because I'd grown up being told that the Nazis were the worst people in the whole world. And now, in my first job as a sort of semi-adult, I was having to recruit them. I was having to turn on a sixpence, he says. And so he was confused, but that was what they did. And I asked what did they do when they found one? He said, well, it was very simple. We just lost the file. We lost the file. And you'll get in the book much more detail than in the podcast of exactly how they did it. And they called it Persilschein, something that washes whiter than white. You would just cleanse these individuals. And I mean, they cleansed some truly terrible people and recruited them. And I, again, don't want to spoil it, but it's utterly staggering what we stumbled across by accident in terms of how high it went. It went right to the very top. And again, without giving away too much, some of you will remember this amazing story that came out within the past month about the world's leading private encryption service company. I don't know if you've spotted this, which encrypts private companies' messages and materials, and 125 governments' private messages and materials. And it turns out it's owned by the CIA. Okay? And who signed the Memorandum of Understanding to create it? A gentleman called Thomas Lucid. Who is Thomas Lucid? Thomas Lucid was the control agent of the most senior Nazi in the intelligence services, who became an American spy in 1947. And who would be 40 years later convicted of mass murder by an Italian court and sentenced to life imprisonment for crimes against humanity. And all along, the Americans and the Brits had known what this man had done, but he became our spy. And I think that sense of corruption, that sense of moral corruption, says a lot about, coming back to where we began with, the true engagement with the idea of international criminal justice and the idea of the rule of law of countries like the United States and the United Kingdom. I'm not for a moment saying they haven't made a significant contribution. They have, and I want them back continuing to make that significant contribution. But there is also another side of the story. It went right to the very top.
Can I not ask a question? Ask a question.
I don't know what...
On that basis, if we go back to the revolutionary nature of sort of the changes in law in the 40s, is the ICC fit for purpose? I mean, what have we got that's strong enough to stand up to that?
I think we're approaching the point. Up until now, the ICC has only indicted people who are black or African. And blacks and Africans don't have a monopoly on international crime. And that has caused outrage, totally justifiably, in my view, in Africa, that it has become lopsided as Nuremberg was lopsided in terms of the delivery of the justice system. The theory is it applies to all, but in fact you only target certain people. So the rubber is about to hit the road. The rubber is going to hit the road because the International Criminal Court has in the last week given authority to proceed to investigate Afghanistan, including American nationals.
But the Americans have said they won't cooperate.
Well, that's right. But what will happen when, as I think is now likely to happen, the court gives the prosecutor authority to investigate allegations of British torture in Iraq, because we have not, pursuant to the principle of complementarity, investigated our own allegations of alleged torture. At that point, what does the UK do? When the ICC was created, I would have said the UK would tough it out and would participate. But if you add up what is happening now across the board, European Convention on Human Rights, European communities, and something that people in the UK don't know anything about, but is a major story in other parts of the world, Chagos, a place no one knows about. It's one of the great untold scandals in the United Kingdom. And just to declare an interest, I'm lead counsel for Mauritius in the case against the UK, so I'm not an independent observer in this matter. But the African Union, led by Mauritius, a year ago obtained a decision of the International Court of Justice ruling that the United Kingdom's occupation of something known as the British Indian Ocean Territory, the last British colony in Africa, is illegal. And that with that illegality, the removal of the entire population of the Chagos archipelago between 68 and 73 is illegal, and they have a right to return. And the United Kingdom has said we will not give effect to that decision of the International Court of Justice, and the United Kingdom before the General Assembly of the United Nations. And this, I think, tells you where the UK and the US are in the world today. The ICJ advisory opinion went to the General Assembly, Resolution 73295, last May, and it was passed by an overwhelming majority. The UK and the US persuaded 4 countries out of 200 to oppose the resolution. The 4 countries were Hungary, Australia, Israel, and the Maldives. Otherwise, there was abstention by a few countries, but overwhelmingly approved. And that tells you something about the place of the United Kingdom and, to a lesser extent perhaps, the United States in the world today, and where the tide is running. And that act of now not allowing the Chagosians who want to return to Chagos is, in my view, arguably a crime against humanity, because they have been forcibly removed, and the International Court has said they have a right to go back. So the UK is right now finding itself in a very, very isolated position internationally, and that is the result of a series of decisions taken by this government and its predecessor government, which essentially is now sticking 2 fingers up at the rule of law internationally. And the commitment of the rule of law of the United Kingdom is part of Britain's global brand and global reputation. It's really important. And trashing British judges, which is also something this government is now willing to do, undermines the UK internationally. You know, again, this was not reported in the UK. When the Prime Minister went to speak at the General Assembly last autumn, as you know, there's the annual gathering of heads of government and heads of state, it happened to be the morning, but with the time difference, it played against the Prime Minister. The Supreme Court ruled by 11 votes to 0 that the proroguing of Parliament was unlawful under English law. Every single ambassador in the UN knew about it, and when Johnson stood up, people laughed, okay, because it's a really small world. So the hubris today about Britain and the world and global Britain and Great Britain and free trade agreements all over the place, it is total crap. I mean, it is total bollocks. And you get that and contest it most easily on this idea of free trade agreements. There is a golden rule in negotiating free trade agreements. You do them seriatim, one after the other. You don't negotiate them at the same time, because you need to leverage what you are negotiating in the first one and what you obtain with what you're going to get in the next one. So the most valuable thing the United Kingdom can have in negotiating a trade agreement, and I negotiate trade agreements, so I know a little bit about it, is access to EU markets. Not being able to say that something imported into the United Kingdom can be onward transmitted to the rest of the European Union significantly downplays your leverage. But that's what they're doing with the United States, whilst at the same time, literally in parallel, negotiating with the European Union and with various other parts of the world. It is completely bonkers. And the people in the British government, including the nice New Zealand gentleman who's been brought in to help them negotiate all their international trade agreements, are literally pulling their hair out at the idiocy of the government's negotiating positions, because adopt one position against the US, it undermines your negotiation with the EU. Adopt a different position with the EU, and it undermines your position with the United States. So they have just got themselves into a humongous mess. And the upshot will be in the outcomes of these negotiations, which will reflect the same kind of magnificent success as in the General Assembly resolution on Chagos. It's absolutely hopeless.
Any other hands? Because if not, I would love to read something that I heard you say at a lecture. It was just a line that stood out to me. You said, I've been involved in far too many cases of mass killing, and I've seen far too many mass graves. It just sort of struck me, because you're a very jolly man, as you said, you're quite fun. And but how do you cope with that on a personal level? How does that affect you?
Well,
because it's not most people's jobs.
I mean, I have a fantastic support network. I mean, it's a complex question. I mean, I spent many years, you know, I grew up in a family that was a sort of Holocaust family. My mum was a hidden child. She was born in 1938. I went this weekend to see Leopoldstadt, actually, the Tom Stoppard play, and it's exactly her story, in a certain sense. And she was born in July 38 after the Anschluss, and then went to Paris and was then hidden for nearly 5 years, and would never talk about anything that happened in that period. She claims to have no memory about it, but for my brother and I, and you know my brother very well, and he's also a very jolly person, actually.
Jolly person, yeah.
We grew up in a family where we knew there were things that you couldn't talk about. And so later in life, and I'll speak only about myself rather than my brother's path, for me, there was a lot of coming to terms and dealing with that in my late 20s. And a very, you know, in America you can talk about it completely openly. In Britain, no one talks about being in analysis or being in conversation of that kind. But I had an extensive period with a fantastic analyst who really, really helped me to engage with things that were buried incredibly deep and to begin to come to terms with them and to understand them. And I think that, coupled with a small number of extraordinary friendships and a fantastic family. I mean, I'm very close to my brother, and I'm very close to my best friend, which is my wife. It's the ability to talk about things when you're going through them. I mean, I came back from the Myanmar hearings. It's not that you go through these experiences and you're just joking about it. Absolutely not. I mean, the Myanmar hearing was very, very painful, which took place in the 9th to the 12th of December in The Hague, because the Dutch government, which I thought was an incredibly decent thing to do, said, look, this case brought by the Gambia against Myanmar at the International Court of Justice, it's really about the Rohingya community. And so it's really important there should be people from the Rohingya community present in the courtroom. And so they went and found, with the help of various NGOs, a group of young Rohingyans who were willing and wanted to come to The Hague. And they, some of you may know, if you're Rohingyan born in Myanmar, you have no citizenship. You're not entitled to the nationality of Myanmar, which is scandalous. Which means they don't have any passports, which means they can't travel, which means they're completely stuck in camps generously supplied by Bangladesh, but still not great conditions, in a place called Cox's Bazar. And 4 of them came over, and they were incredible people. They were really incredible people. And 3 were women and 1 was a man, and the women had all been systematically raped. I mean, on an industrial scale, over an extended period of time. And they had 2 had been through therapy, and they wanted to talk about it. And they found themselves, unbelievably, in the same room as Aung San Suu Kyi. Okay, so you've got to pause for a moment. I mean, it was an incredible thing. And again, just to pause that for the moment, a week earlier, I'd been in Washington, D.C. on a panel at George Washington University with an extraordinary man called Thomas Bergenthal, who was the American judge at the International Court of Justice, before whom I'd argued cases, and who was an academic who I'd come to know very well. But in an earlier life, Tom Bergenthal was at Auschwitz in the care of Joseph Mengele. He's written an extraordinary book called A Lucky Child, which was a huge bestseller and is absolutely worth reading. He's one of the most decent, wonderful human beings I've ever come across. And I was explaining to Tom that next week we were going to the International Court, and Aung San Suu Kyi was coming, and these people were coming from the Rohingya community, and Tom just looked at me and my colleague on the panel, and he said, gosh, how extraordinary. In 1942, the idea, whilst we were in Auschwitz, that there would be court proceedings going on, and the head of Germany would somehow go to an international court to try to defend it was just astonishing. And at that moment, you realise that however pitiful it is, however inadequate it is, something has happened in the last 75 years. And so you live through an experience like the Myanmar hearings, which are deeply painful. The facts are terrible. I mean, just absolutely terrible. And what is the British government doing about it? Bugger all. Trying to negotiate trade agreements with Myanmar and its great friend, China. That is the British government's position. It is absolutely outrageous what is going on. And these people were there, and that was very painful, and you have difficult moments where you explain to them, you're going to show things on the screen in court from which they may wish to avert their eyes, but we need to show this in order to let the judges know through visual imagery what is actually going on the ground. That churns you up. But the other side of it is, you come out of it, and there was a single photograph which really made all of us weep. It was an amazing photograph, the day of the order of the court. It was just an injunction hearing. It was a provisional measures order of the International Court of Justice. Unique, has never happened before. 17 votes to 0, ordering Myanmar to stop these acts, ordering Myanmar to not destroy the evidence, ordering Myanmar to report every 6 months on what it is doing to comply with the judgment, which the court has never done before. And that afternoon, a photograph appeared in one of the cabs. It was an amazing photograph. Hundreds of people holding up a sign saying, "Thank you, Gambia." It was an amazing thing. And again, as with East West Street, a couple of remarkable individuals, Lauterpacht and Lemkin, how does a case get to the International Court of Justice? Why the Gambia, people say? Very, very simple. the Attorney General of the Gambia, who happens to be a former student of mine at University of London, went on to be a prosecutor at the Rwanda Tribunal. The Organisation of Islamic Countries were invited to visit the camps in 2018. His foreign minister couldn't go, so his president sent him instead. And he spent 4 days in the camps in Cox's Bazar. And as he said to me, I know a genocide when I see one, and this is genocide. And I'm going to persuade my government to bring the case. So it's that you come across horrible things, but with all of the horrible things, you also come across extraordinary human beings. And resilience and wonderfulness and senses of collegiality and community, and that makes you realise that human life can be absolutely fantastic. It can be terrible, but it can also be absolutely fantastic. And we have to celebrate each day that we have where we're healthy and well and surrounded by people, you know, we love and have fun times with, and those are the great things in life. But that doesn't mean you don't live through incredibly difficult times. It's a very difficult balancing exercise. And people forget about who are the interpreters in these trials. I mean, post-traumatic stress for interpreters, for lawyers, you know, wonderful Fergal Keane, who's taken leave from the BBC because he's been on so many of these places, and others here have been in these places too. I mean, it takes its toll in a certain way, and at some point, no doubt, something happens. It's very complex.
Thank you. There's a hand there, and then there's a hand at the back.
You know a thing or two.
Yes, indeed. Nick Gowing from the Thinking the Unthinkable project. Let me ask my non-question, which is that actually, judging by what you said and judging by the kind of observations we have, that essentially international law is beginning to unravel. And it's being promoted by a number of countries. But here we are on the opening of the MH17 trial. What is there to stop this kind of thing happening with Russia, with China over the islands, the Rohingyas and so on? In other words, there are those out there who are prepared to say, look what America's doing, look what Britain is doing, look what the Russians and Chinese are doing, we can do this as well. In other words, much of what we've taken for granted is unravelling, which leads to the issue of impunity.
Yes, but nature abhors a vacuum. It's really fascinating. So, on human rights, you're absolutely right. And on the law of the sea, in relation to the South China Seas case, which I know well, I was counsel for the Philippines, so I've seen what's happened with China in that case, although I think ultimately China will comply with that decision. But go to other areas. I mentioned before the WTO appellate body. Okay, it is totally fascinating. And it's not yet been picked up yet, perhaps because it's not yet public. But Trump has basically shut down the WTO dispute settlement system by refusing to appoint the American judge, and to appoint any new member of the appellate body, so it's no longer quorate, it can therefore no longer sit, and therefore it's taken out of the process. So what has happened? What has happened is the EU, the Russians, and the Chinese have come together and have said, no, we're going to save the WTO appellate body. We're not going to let the Americans get away with it. We believe in an appellate body on economic issues. We believe in global free trade, and we are going to make sure that that institution is saved. And the consequence of that has been that privately, for the first time 2 weeks ago, I was told by someone who was in on the discussion, the Americans are just beginning to shift their positions. And it does now begin to seem that if they can find a face-saving way out, to allow the Americans to come back on board, which they will do, and it's often about face-saving ways out, that institution will, contrary to what I thought 6 months ago, actually be saved. And then look at the story of the Genocide Convention and Myanmar. So it's a pretty wild situation when you go to the hearings in The Hague and the entire Organisation of Islamic Countries supports the case brought by the Gambia, okay, and hosts a reception for the council and the others in the team, and you're hanging out with those great proponents of human rights, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, the Emirates, all of a sudden have discovered that actually yeah, this genocide convention is not such a bad thing. And actually, recourse to the International Court of Justice perhaps can help this community, this Muslim community in Rakhine State that calls itself the Rohingya. And actually, yes, we're willing to take those cases. So that's why I think it's actually much, much more complex. And if you look at the Chagos case, it's also totally fascinating. It's the first time, I'm told, in the history of the whole of the United Nations, over 75 years, that the entire African continent has voted together to take on the Brits. That has never happened before, because the one issue on which they're united is on colonialism and decolonisation. And so, yes, there is an effort at an unravelling. Yes, absolutely, you're right.
And impunity?
And impunity, we see now the International Criminal Court drifting down. There was the high point after 1998. But I think it's a long game. I don't think the idea of accountability for leaders and the idea of international criminal justice will go away. It will fade in its application, and then something will happen which will bring it back. And I think these things go in cycles, but it won't disappear completely, but it will be a tough few years. Absolutely. You're both wrong and right, if you see what I'm saying. You're not wrong and you're not right. It's a really much... It's politics. It's just much, much more complex, I think, than simple binaries of black and white, this is happening, this is not happening. Actually, once you're buried in the beast of it, it's much, much more complex.
There was one question, the flag's gone up, I'm going to allow it.
I'm Kerry, I work here. I was going to take you back to the beginning. You raised this question of, so politically we're on this path that we know can lead to a very terrible destination. We don't know where we are on it, and it's by no means guaranteed that the destination is not guaranteed. The sort of moral case you raised, which is of civil servants working in this country or in the States, then have this unenviable dilemma. And there may not be a right or a wrong answer to this one either. But the safest thing to do would be to adopt a kind of precautionary principle and say, because I can see this path, I know where it can end, I'm out of this now. But if you do that, then you know that you're playing into the hands of people who want a different type of civil service. You're expediting that end, and that doesn't feel right either. So I'm afraid it is a question, but when people come to you with that unanswerable dilemma, what do you say?
It's really difficult. I think back to the Iraq War. People in the Foreign Office, ambassadors, legal advisors, found themselves in an acute sense of difficulty because they knew what had happened. They knew that essentially a lie had been laid out on the table and that the Prime Minister had not received legal advice, saying that he could do what he could do. So the question was, do you bail? Do you stay? I think I wouldn't give anyone particular advice. I think it's for each person within their own conscience to work out what to do. But for myself, I'd rather people who have those values being there than not being there. I have one really good friend who's a legal advisor in the US Department of State, who at the time that Trump was elected, we had a long conversation. What do I do? Do I stay? Do I go? And in the end, again, it was for her to decide. But my feeling was, we're better off having you there. There will be times where you're asked to do things that you just don't agree with, that you object to, that you think might cross lines, but you will serve as a force which restrains what can and cannot be done. Because we know that the making of decisions is subtle and complex, and it has an impact. And I think that right now for the civil servants in this country who are facing, I think many of them, a pretty terrible couple of years, the ones that I know are hugely impressive people. And I may agree or disagree on a particular issue, on advice given, whatever, but in a sense that doesn't matter. It's the bigger issue is the values they bring in the totality of the advice and assistance they offer. And I think it would be absolutely tragic to lose that community from the decision-making process. And I think one has to look to the long term. There would be a vacuum, new types of people would be brought in who perhaps could not be relied upon to give independent advice. I mean, I'm being careful what I say, but not so careful. Let's compare the previous Attorney General with the current Attorney General. Okay, the previous Attorney General was one we know. You know, I mean, I know him well. There are things I agree with him about, there are things I disagree with him about. But one thing that I know about him is he's totally independent. You know, with that fellow, he really cares about his reputation at the bar, and at the end of the day, he is going to give them independent legal advice. And that's why they got rid of him, because he could not be relied upon to give them the kind of advice they wanted. And so they brought in a place person, just as they did with the new Chancellor. They brought in a person who, it seems, they believe is going to give them what they want. Now, whether that turns out to be the case is another matter, because I think when people get into that office, the being in that office has an impact, and you actually want to be remembered by your peers in the community in which you engage. But plainly now there is an effort to replace independent spirits with less independent spirits, and one of the fantastic things about the British civil service, and you know, it's a real marvel of Britain that people do not appreciate. I think it is the only country in the world where, as a barrister, you act against the UK time after time, you humiliate them before international courts, you win cases, you lose cases, you're against the UK, but your relations with the civil servants in the Foreign Office remain excellent, because they know you're just doing your work as an independent barrister, and it causes no trouble at all. I also happen to have French nationality, and when I acted against France in the resumed nuclear test case in 1995, the French establishment just came down on me like a ton of bricks. I mean, it didn't matter, I'm still an English barrister, you do what you do. That never happens in the UK. And that sense of respect for independence of spirit is a vital, valuable, magnificent thing. And it has to be absolutely looked after in our civil service and in our judiciary. And in both, it's under threat. But coming back to the positive side, I think ultimately it will prevail, and this government will not succeed in replacing an independent spirit with a less independent spirit. And I think it's just built into the DNA, and it's part of that sense of fairness and that part of the sense of professionalism that will sustain. But it means that people who are under attack and who can't speak up for themselves because they're professional, they are entitled to the support, you know, of others in the community to stand up for them and go the extra mile to speak out for them. I think the judges are going to have a very tough time. And I was on a panel yesterday with John Dyson and Dinah Rose at a book festival, and you know, it's plain. There's real trouble coming. Decades, centuries of respect for the independent advisor. If they could get rid of it in the next few weeks, they're going to get rid of it.
Thank you, Philippe. I'm going to sum up now. I'm going to try and do it quickly because we've gone madly over time. It's so interesting. So obviously you started with your interesting comparison of Lviv and London, which I think you first made in 2016. Your question, could it happen here? Yes, it could. You were emphatic about. You see the warning signs of what we saw in the 20s and 30s, the foreigner no longer being welcome. Your sorry tale of the students who won't go outside London really stayed with me. What you called the shredding of the European Court of Human Rights with the terms "Make America Great Again" and Brexit. And I think, Nick, you touched on how you felt international law, this is Nick, isn't it? It's beginning to unravel. People have always assumed that we've had these rights, but it's only since 45 they've been set in stone, as you will discover in East West Street. If you haven't read it already, it's being sold right in the back there, and Philippe will be signing, so please do go and say hello if you're interested in buying a copy of that. They are fragile laws, but they are also well established. Thank you for talking about your relationship with horse, which I've always been incredibly interested in, and other fascinating aspects of the Ratline, such as the use of Americans and Brits, of the cleansing of Nazis, as it were, to help fight the communists. Tess asked a very interesting question: is the ICC fit for purpose? Until now, I had learnt tonight it has only indicted blacks and Africans, but the situation is changing. That was right, isn't it? The situation is changing with the allegations of torture in Afghanistan, and your really interesting Chagos case, where the UK is in an isolated position internationally, and our public standing in the world is very much undermined. In fact, I think you called British hubris total crap and total bollocks, I've written down. And how we're terribly negotiating our trade agreements, that everyone, is pulling their hair out of the idiocy of how we're going about it. You paused before talking really interestingly, I thought, about how your friends and family support you, and what must at times be an incredibly difficult job. But I've written down something you said, which is that you come across horrible things, but also extraordinary human beings, which make you realise human life can be fantastic. And I think we can all agree you are an extraordinary human being doing extraordinary work. So thank you very much for your time tonight.